Some men are born with gifts. Others earn them through decades of discipline, sacrifice, and pain. And then there are those rare few who simply take what they see and make it their own. Tony Masters was never the strongest. He was never the fastest. He was never the most powerful. He was something far more dangerous. He was the man who could watch you fight for 100 years and learn everything you knew in a single afternoon. The contract had arrived like every other contract. Well-funded. The kind of job that promised enough money to disappear for 6 months and live like a king in a country that did not ask questions. The target was an artifact buried beneath an abandoned Hydra facility somewhere in the mountains of Eastern Europe. The briefing was vague, which was normal. The pay was extraordinary, which was unusual. And the client insisted on absolute discretion, which meant whoever wanted this artifact retrieved did not want the rest of the world to know it existed. Tony Masters had stopped asking questions years ago. Questions were a luxury reserved for people who had something to lose. He had a shield. He had a sword. He had a tactical mind that processed combat information the way a supercomputer processed data. And he had the one ability that made him the most expensive mercenary on the planet. Photographic reflexes. The gift, or perhaps the curse, that allowed him to replicate any physical action he witnessed. Any fighting style. Any technique, any movement, no matter how complex, became permanently etched into his muscle memory the moment he watched it performed. The facility was old. The kind of old that made the air feel heavy, as though the walls themselves remembered what had been done inside them. Hydra had abandoned this site decades ago, but the architecture still carried the unmistakable signature of an organization that had spent centuries hoarding artifacts it did not understand. Reinforced corridors. Blast doors sealed with rusted hydraulics, and beneath it all, a chamber that hummed with something that was not electricity. The artifact sat on a pedestal in the center of the room. It was small, no larger than a human fist, and it pulsed with a faint crimson glow that seemed to breathe in rhythm with something far older than any machine. Taskmaster approached it the way he approached everything. Calmly, methodically. His eyes cataloged every detail of the room. Exit points. Structural weaknesses. The subtle vibration in the floor that suggested the chamber extended deeper than it appeared. He reached for the artifact with gloved fingers, and in the instant his hand made contact, the world fractured. There was no explosion. No flash of blinding light. No deafening roar. Instead, the air simply split open, as though reality itself had been a sheet of paper and something had torn a hole straight through it. The rift swallowed him whole. Sound disappeared. Light disappeared. Gravity became a suggestion rather than a law. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. He was lying on wet stone. The air was cold and tasted of rust and ancient sewage. Above him, a vaulted ceiling of cracked bricks stretched into darkness, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the low rumble of a city that did not know he existed. He sat up slowly, cataloging his surroundings the way his mind always cataloged everything. Underground tunnel system, European architecture, 19th century construction, possibly older beneath the surface layer. He was still armed. His shield was intact. His sword was sheathed at his hip. Whatever had just happened, it had transported him somewhere else entirely. He recognized the architecture before he recognized the city. The ornate stonework, the narrow alleys. The particular way old Europe layered centuries of history on top of itself, each era built directly above the ruins of the last. He emerged from the tunnels into a deserted street, and for a moment the silence was absolute. Then the sounds reached him. Not the sounds of a city. Something older. Something violent. Steel against steel. Growls that belonged to no animal he had ever encountered. And beneath it all, a hissing sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He moved toward the noise the way a predator moves toward prey. Not with fear. Not with caution. With curiosity. Because Tony Masters had learned long ago that the unknown was not something to be feared. It was something to be studied. What he found in that courtyard would have broken most men. Two factions were at war. On one side, figures in dark leather moved with a speed that defied human biology. Their eyes glowed pale blue in the darkness. Their swords traced arcs through the air so fast the steel became invisible. They fought with the precision of soldiers who had spent centuries refining their craft. Though Taskmaster did not know that word yet, On the other side, massive figures shifted between human and beast forms with a ferocity that turned flesh into something monstrous. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles swelled beneath stretching skin, jaws elongated into fangs designed to tear through armor and bone alike. Werewolves of ancient blood, driven by rage and instinct and centuries of hatred. Any sane man would have run. Any trained soldier would have sought cover and called for extraction that would never come. Taskmaster did neither. He stood at the edge of the courtyard and he watched. His eyes tracked every movement, every sword stroke, every transformation sequence. Every defensive parry, every offensive lunge, every acrobatic evasion that these supernatural warriors executed with the confidence of creatures who had never needed to fear a human opponent. His mind was already recording. Every technique, every stance, every weight shift and footwork pattern. The way the vampires favored thrusting attacks aimed at the heart. The way the Lycans used their transformation mid-combat to generate explosive bursts of speed. The way both species compensated for strengths and exploited weaknesses in patterns that had been refined over hundreds of years of mutual slaughter. A Lycan broke from the melee and charged toward him. It was enormous, nearly 8 feet of muscle and fury, with claws that could shred steel. Taskmaster did not flinch. He raised his shield, angled it at precisely 37 degrees, and deflected the claw strike upward. The Lycan stumbled. Taskmaster stepped inside its guard and drove his sword through its chest with a thrust he had copied from one of the vampires not 60 seconds earlier. The creature fell, and in the silence that followed, every fighter in that courtyard stopped and turned to look at the masked man who had just killed a Lycan with a technique he had learned by watching. The vampires attacked next, 3 of them, moving as a coordinated unit, their swords flashing in patterns designed to overwhelm through sheer speed. Taskmaster met the first blade with his shield, sidestepped the second by executing a footwork pattern he had observed the lead vampire using moments before, and disarmed the third with a technique so precise it looked rehearsed. In 4 seconds, 3 warriors who had spent centuries mastering swordsmanship lay disarmed on the ground. The courtyard fell silent. Vampires and Lycans alike stared at the figure in the skull mask, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. A human. An ordinary human with no supernatural strength, no accelerated healing, no fangs or claws or immortality. A human who had watched them fight for less than 5 minutes and already wielded their own techniques better than most of them could. From the shadows of an adjacent alley, a figure watched. She moved like moonlight made lethal. Silver hair catching the dim glow of distant street lamps. Eyes that had seen 6 centuries of war and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Selene, the death dealer, the most feared vampire warrior in the coven, stood motionless as she watched Taskmaster defeat an elite vampire swordsman using a combination of Lycan footwork and vampire blade work fused together so seamlessly it created something neither species had ever seen. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched, and for the first time in 600 years, Selene felt something she could not name. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, something closer to recognition, as though she was looking at a creature that understood war the same way she understood it, not as a duty, not as a burden, as a language spoken in blood and steel. And this man, this impossible human, had just demonstrated that he could learn any dialect in moments. Taskmaster sheathed his sword and looked directly at the shadows where she stood. He could not see her, but he knew she was there. The same way he always knew when someone was watching. His head tilted slightly, acknowledging her presence without a word. Then he turned and walked into the darkness of the Budapest streets, leaving behind a courtyard full of immortal warriors who had just learned that the most dangerous thing in their world was not a vampire. It was not a Lycan. It was a human who could become anything he saw. They came for him before dawn. 12 death dealers moving in perfect formation through the narrow streets of the old city. Selene led them. Taskmaster did not resist. He had expected this. Captured warriors were interrogated, and a man who had just defeated elite fighters from both immortal species was worth more information than any artifact they had ever recovered. They brought him to the heart of the vampire coven. A vast subterranean hall beneath an estate that looked abandoned from the surface but descended into architecture that predated the city above by centuries. Victor was waiting. He sat on a throne carved from black stone, his pale features frozen in an expression of controlled authority. Victor was old, older than the Coven itself. His eyes carried the particular weight of a being who had seen empires rise and fall and had personally orchestrated the collapse of several. He did not stand when Taskmaster was brought before him. He did not need to. Power that ancient did not need to demonstrate itself. It simply existed, and everything in the room oriented itself around that existence. The council flanked him on both sides. 7 vampires, each one a warrior of considerable age and skill. Taskmaster scanned them the way he scanned every room. The way each one rested their weight. Which ones were swordsmen? Which ones preferred close-quarters combat? Which ones carried concealed weapons? Within 30 seconds, he had cataloged more information about their collective fighting ability than most people would gather in a lifetime. Victor spoke first. His voice was calm and measured, carrying the tone of someone who was unaccustomed to being required to ask questions, but was willing to make exceptions when circumstances demanded it. He asked what Taskmaster was, not who. Because no human should have been able to do what the courtyard witnesses had described. No human should have been able to replicate centuries-old combat techniques after a single observation. Victor had seen many things in his long existence. He had seen werewolves evolve. He had seen vampires betray their own blood. He had seen wars that reshaped continents. But he had never seen a human who could steal the skills of immortals simply by watching them. Taskmaster answered honestly, because honesty in this situation was more valuable than deception. He explained his ability in simple terms. Photographic reflexes. Whatever he saw, he could replicate. Whatever technique he witnessed, he could reproduce. He did not know how he had arrived in this world. He did not know how to return. And he had no allegiance to anyone or anything in this place. Victor listened without interrupting. When Taskmaster finished, the silence in the hall lasted nearly a full minute. It was the silence of a predator deciding whether to kill or to keep. Victor chose to keep, not out of kindness. Victor did not possess kindness in any quantity that mattered. He chose to keep Taskmaster because a weapon that could learn any fighting style in seconds was infinitely more valuable than a corpse that could learn nothing. He ordered Taskmaster confined to the training grounds under constant observation. The arrangement was simple. Taskmaster would be allowed to live, allowed to train, allowed to observe the Coven warriors in exchange for his cooperation in future engagements against the Lycans. It was not a negotiation. It was a sentence dressed in the language of an offer. Taskmaster accepted, not because he feared Victor, but because the Coven training grounds contained more accumulated combat knowledge in a single room than he had encountered in his entire career. Vampires did not age. They did not forget. Every technique they had learned over centuries remained as sharp as the day it was first practiced. And Taskmaster was about to spend hours watching warriors who had been perfecting their craft since before the fall of Rome. The training sessions became his education. He watched a vampire named Soren practice a sword form that traced its origins to 15th century Wallachia. He studied it, reproduced it, perfected it within the hour. He observed an elder named Craven executing close-quarters combat maneuvers designed for fighting transformed Lycans in confined spaces. He absorbed the technique so quickly that by the second day, he was correcting minor inefficiencies in the forms that the original practitioners had never noticed. The vampires watched him learn with growing unease. There was something profoundly unsettling about watching a human master techniques that had taken them decades to develop. It was not jealousy, not exactly. It was closer to the feeling of watching a mirror that reflected back something better than what stood in front of it. Taskmaster did not simply copy their movements. He refined them. He identified the wasted motion, the unnecessary weight shifts, the microsecond delays between intention and execution that even immortal warriors carried without realizing it. And he stripped those imperfections away with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing dead tissue. Meanwhile, above ground, the hunt had begun. Lucian, leader of the Lycan resistance, had received reports of the courtyard incident. A masked human who had killed one of his warriors and disarmed 3 of the Coven soldiers using techniques from both species. Lucian was not a creature given to fear. He had survived centuries of persecution, had built an army from nothing, had waged a guerrilla war against an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned him at every turn. But he understood threats the way Taskmaster understood combat, instinctively. Completely. And something about this masked human triggered every survival instinct he possessed. He dispatched scouts to find him. They searched the city for 3 days and found nothing. Taskmaster had vanished into the Coven underground, and the Lycans had no access to those depths. But the reports continued. Rumors filtering through the supernatural underground. Stories of a human who fought like a vampire and moved like a Lycan. A human who carried a shield and sword and wore a skull mask that revealed nothing about the face beneath it. Lucian listened to every report with the same focused intensity, building a profile of his enemy piece by piece. What he assembled was a portrait of something that should not have existed. Selene watched Taskmaster more closely than anyone. She was assigned to monitor his training sessions, a duty she accepted without protest because it aligned perfectly with her own curiosity. What she saw during those sessions disturbed her in ways she could not articulate. She had spent 6 centuries perfecting her combat skills. 600 years of daily practice, of refining every movement until her body executed techniques without conscious thought. And this human was matching her level of proficiency in days. Not weeks, not months. She approached him once between sessions. Her question was direct. How could a human with no supernatural abilities learn faster than immortals who had spent lifetimes mastering their craft? Taskmaster looked at her with the calm, measured gaze of someone who had been asked this question many times and had never found a satisfying answer. He told her that most warriors spent their lives practicing what they already knew. They refined, they repeated, but they rarely watched others with the intention of truly learning. Observation, he said, was the most undervalued weapon in existence. Every fighter in the world was teaching you something every time they moved. Most people simply were not paying attention. Selene considered this. She considered the 6 centuries she had spent training and realized that she had spent most of them with her eyes focused inward, on her own technique, her own perfection. She had rarely watched others with the sole purpose of absorbing what they knew. The realization was quietly devastating. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. Victor descended to the training grounds to personally evaluate the human his coven had captured. He did not do this often. Victor considered training a matter for subordinate, but the reports had been too extraordinary to ignore, and Victor was not a creature who trusted second-hand accounts. He selected a sparring partner for himself and demonstrated his personal combat style, a method of swordsmanship so ancient that its origins predated the vampire race itself. It was fluid and brutal and beautiful, designed for a warrior who possessed both supernatural speed and centuries of practical battlefield experience. Taskmaster watched from the edge of the training circle. He watched for exactly 90 seconds. Then Victor gestured for him to step forward. What followed silenced every vampire in the room. Taskmaster raised his sword and executed Victor fighting style flawlessly. Not approximately, not close enough to be impressive. Flawlessly. Every stance, every transition, every weight shift and blade angle matched the ancient form with a precision that suggested he had been practicing it for years rather than having observed it for less than 2 minutes. Victor recognized his own technique staring back at him through the blade of a human, and for the first time in his ancient existence, something cold and unfamiliar moved through his chest. It was not fear. Victor did not fear. But it was the awareness that he was looking at something that could become more dangerous than anything his coven had ever produced. The training hall fell silent. Every vampire present understood what they had just witnessed. And in that silence, a single truth settled over the coven like frost. Experience alone was no longer enough. Centuries of accumulated skill could now be stolen in moments by a human who carried no supernatural power at all. The rules of their ancient war had just changed, and no one in that room was prepared for what that meant. Lucian struck within the week. Coordinated attacks across 3 European cities simultaneously. Prague. Vampire strongholds that had stood for centuries found themselves overwhelmed by Lycan forces that had been planning this offensive for months. The coven reeled. Their infrastructure was scattered, their supply lines severed, their warriors spread too thin to mount an effective defense. Victor demanded retaliation, but retaliation required soldiers, and soldiers were exactly what the coven could not afford to lose. Taskmaster volunteered. Not out of loyalty. He owed the vampires nothing. He had no stake in their ancient war, no genetic investment in the survival of either species. He volunteered because every battle was a classroom and every enemy was a teacher. The Lycans fought differently than vampires. They relied on pack tactics, on transformation bursts, on the raw physical superiority that came with being 8 feet of muscle and fury and teeth. Taskmaster wanted to understand that style the same way he had understood the vampire sword forms. Not from watching, from fighting. His first engagement was in Prague. A Lycan assault team had breached a vampire safe house and was systematically executing the occupants. Taskmaster arrived alone. The Lycans numbered 9. They were mid-transformation when he entered the building, which meant they were confident. They had no reason to expect resistance from anything that mattered. He killed 4 of them in the first 30 seconds. Not through superior strength, through superior understanding. He had spent days studying Lycan transformation sequences, memorizing the precise moments when their bones reset and their muscles realigned. Those moments lasted less than a second, but during that fractional window, a Lycan was vulnerable. Their bodies were between states, neither fully human nor fully beast. And Taskmaster had learned to exploit that transition with the precision of a clockmaker disassembling a mechanism. The remaining 5 Lycans regrouped and attacked together. Flanking maneuvers designed to overwhelm through numbers rather than skill. Taskmaster responded with a combination no one in this world had ever seen. He used vampire footwork to evade the first attacker, Lycan hunting patterns to predict the second movement, and a disarming technique borrowed from a 14th century European dueling manual he had once skimmed in a library to neutralize the third. By the time the 5th Lycan realized what was happening, it was already too late. Word spread, through both factions, through the supernatural underground that connected every vampire coven and every Lycan pack across the continent. The masked human was fighting on the vampire side, and he was winning. Not occasionally, not through luck. He was winning every engagement with a consistency that defied probability. Lycan packs that had hunted vampires for generations found themselves outmaneuvered by a human who seemed to know their tactics before they executed them. Taskmaster defended stronghold after stronghold. Each battle taught him something new. In Vienna, he encountered a Lycan elder who fought with a style that combined primal ferocity with genuine martial discipline. Taskmaster spent the first 2 minutes of their duel purely on defense, absorbing every technique the elder displayed, cataloging every movement pattern. Then he began attacking, using the elder's own style against him. The fight lasted another 40 seconds. When it ended, the elder lay unconscious on the stone floor, defeated by a human who had learned his lifetime of combat experience in the time it took to boil water. In Warsaw, he studied ancient vampire sword forms that had been preserved in a coven archive for 5 centuries. The forms were ceremonial, no longer used in practical combat, but their principles were profound. Balance management, energy conservation, the philosophy of using an opponent's momentum against them rather than meeting force with force. Taskmaster absorbed these forms and immediately integrated them into his evolving combat system. Within hours, he was executing techniques that no living vampire had bothered to master, and he was applying them in live combat against enemies who had never seen them before. The fusion began. Vampire swordsmanship, Lycan hunting tactics, death dealer precision strikes, military formations borrowed from human warfare spanning 1,000 years of recorded history. Taskmaster did not simply collect these styles. He wove them together. He found the connections between them, the places where one tradition complemented another, where a vampire defensive parry could flow seamlessly into a Lycan offensive burst. He was building something new, a combat system that did not belong to any single species or any single era. It belonged to him. Selene fought alongside him during the Warsaw defense. She had requested the assignment, though she would never have admitted that her reasons were more personal than tactical. During the battle, she found herself unable to predict his movements. She had studied his fighting style, had spent hours reviewing footage of his engagements, had memorized every pattern she could identify. And yet, in the chaos of live combat, Taskmaster moved in ways she had never seen before. He was not repeating techniques. He was generating new combinations in real time, pulling from a library so vast that no single engagement could exhaust its variations. She asked him about it afterward. He told her that most warriors had a style, a set of preferred movements that defined how they fought. He had none. His style was every style. His signature was the absence of a signature. He fought differently against every opponent because every opponent required something different. The greatest weakness any fighter could have, he said, was predictability. And he had made himself impossible to predict by becoming everyone and no one at the same time. The reports reached Lucian within days. Detailed accounts from surviving Lycan warriors. Descriptions of a fighting style that shifted between engagements like water changing shape to fill whatever container it was poured into. Warriors who had fought the masked human described the experience as deeply unsettling. Not because he was stronger or faster. He was neither. But because he seemed to already know what you were going to do before you did it. As though he had been fighting you for years and you were only just encountering him for the first time. Lucian convened his war council. The room was tense. His lieutenants argued about strategy, about resource allocation, about which strongholds to target next. Lucian listened to none of it. He sat at the head of the table with his fingers pressed together and his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. When the arguments finally subsided, he spoke. His voice was quiet, which meant the room needed to listen harder. He told them that the war had changed. The vampires had always been their primary enemy. But the masked human was not a vampire. He was something else entirely. A creature that could learn anything, adapt to anything, and counter anything they threw at him. Every Lycan who fought him was essentially training him. Every technique they revealed became his weapon. Every tactic they employed became his playbook. They were not losing battles to a superior force. They were losing battles to their own experience, reflected back at them through the blade of a human who learned faster than they could forget. The War Council fell silent. The implication was clear. Continuing to fight Taskmaster conventionally was not merely ineffective. It was counterproductive. Every engagement made him stronger. Every technique displayed became another tool in his arsenal. They were arming their own enemy with every battle they fought. Lucian stood. His decision was made. He would not send another warrior against the masked human. He would go himself, not because he believed he could win through superior power. He went because he understood something the others did not. Taskmaster was a mirror. He reflected whatever was shown to him. And a mirror could not reflect what it could not see. Lucian intended to fight this human not with technique that could be copied, but with something far older and far more personal. He intended to fight him with conviction. Lucian personally challenged Taskmaster. The message was delivered by a lone Lycan courier who approached the Vampire Coven perimeter under a flag of truce. The challenge was simple. Single combat. No factions. No armies. Just two warriors and whatever they brought to the circle. Taskmaster read the message once, folded it, and set it aside. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he spent the next several hours reviewing every piece of information he had gathered about Lucian. Every combat report, every witness account, every fragment of intelligence that described how the Lycan leader fought, moved, thought, and survived. He was preparing, not because he doubted his ability, but because Lucian was not like the others. Lucian had survived centuries of war not through brute force but through intelligence. He was a strategist, not merely a fighter. And Taskmaster understood with the quiet certainty of someone who had studied war his entire life that the most dangerous opponent was never the strongest one. It was the one who understood that strength was only one variable in a much larger equation. They met at dawn in the ruins of a medieval church outside the city. The location was Lucian's choice. Taskmaster accepted it without negotiation. Churches had history in their world. Sacred ground, neutral ground. A place where the ancient war had paused before, in older centuries, when both species still remembered what it meant to fear something greater than each other. The church had been abandoned for decades. Its roof had collapsed inward, leaving the nave open to the gray morning sky. Stone pews lay shattered across the floor. A stone altar, cracked down the center, stood at the far end like a monument to faith that had long since departed. Lucian was waiting when Taskmaster arrived. He stood in his human form. Tall, lean, with the composed bearing of someone who had spent centuries learning to control the beast within, rather than being controlled by it. His eyes were amber. Not the feral amber of a Lycan mid-transformation, but the steady, intelligent amber of a leader who had learned to see clearly even when rage burned behind his gaze. He wore no armor. He carried no weapon. He had come with nothing but his body and his conviction. Taskmaster noted the absence of weapons immediately. It was a statement. Lucian was telling him that this fight was not about technique, not about swords or shields or copied styles. This was about something deeper, something that could not be replicated by watching. They began without ceremony, no declarations, no posturing. Lucian shifted mid-stride, his transformation faster and more controlled than any Taskmaster had witnessed. One moment he was a man, the next he was something else entirely. 7 feet of dark fur and corded muscle, moving with a speed and precision that separated him from every Lycan Taskmaster had previously encountered. Lucian did not fight like a beast. He fought like a martial artist who happened to have claws. The duel was unlike anything the observing warriors from both factions had ever seen. Taskmaster met Lucian's initial assault with his shield, absorbing blows that would have shattered conventional armor. He countered with vampire blade techniques, testing Lucian's defenses, probing for the gaps that existed in every fighting style. Lucian evaded with a fluidity that contradicted his size, shifting between forms mid-combat, sometimes fighting as a man, sometimes as a beast, sometimes as something in between that existed in no natural taxonomy. For 10 minutes they were perfectly matched. Taskmaster copied every technique Lucian revealed, every lunge, every evasion, every transformation sequence that the Lycan leader wove into his attacks. But Lucian did not become frustrated the way every other opponent had. He did not escalate his attacks or abandon his strategy when techniques were countered. He simply kept fighting, kept pressing, kept testing, as though he was not trying to win but trying to understand. And then Taskmaster understood what Lucian was doing. He was not fighting to defeat him. He was fighting to learn him, the same way Taskmaster learned others, through observation, through patience, through the willingness to absorb punishment in exchange for understanding. Lucian had turned Taskmaster's own methodology against him. He was reading the mirror. The realization shifted something in Taskmaster's approach. He stopped copying. For the first time in the entire war, he stopped replicating his opponent's movements and began fighting with combinations that were entirely his own. Original sequences, unorthodox transitions, attacks that did not belong to any tradition because they had never existed before that moment. He was not copying. He was creating. Lucian felt the shift immediately. The attacks became unpredictable. The rhythm broke pattern. Every expectation built over the previous 10 minutes was suddenly invalidated. Taskmaster pressed the advantage with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He drove Lucian back across the nave of the ruined church, past the shattered pews, toward the cracked altar at the far end. And then, with a final combination that blended 5 different traditions into a single seamless motion, he brought Lucian down. The Lycan leader lay on the stone floor, breathing hard, blood pooling beneath him. Taskmaster stood over him with his sword raised. One strike, one movement, and the leader of the Lycan resistance would be gone. Both factions watched from the perimeter. The vampires expected him to finish it. The Lycans expected to witness their leader's death. Taskmaster lowered his sword. He stepped back, sheathed the blade, and looked down at Lucian with an expression that was hidden behind his mask but communicated through the deliberate choice of mercy. Lucian stared up at him. The amber eyes burned with something that was not rage. It was confusion. In all his centuries of war, no one had ever spared him. No one had ever chosen restraint over victory when the killing blow was theirs to deliver. He asked why. His voice was rough, half human and half growl, the transformation still partially active. Taskmaster's answer was simple. He said that killing Lucian would not end the war. It would deepen it. A martyred leader created a cause. A living leader created an opportunity. And Taskmaster had not crossed dimensional barriers to become an executioner for a conflict he did not yet understand. That word. It hung in the cold morning air between them. Lucian heard it. Selene, watching from the shadows, heard it. Even the distant vampires on the perimeter felt the weight of that single word. It implied that Taskmaster was still learning, still processing, still trying to understand a war that both species had accepted as eternal and inevitable. Lucian stood slowly. His wounds were already healing, the supernatural regeneration knitting tissue together with a speed that made human biology look stationary by comparison. He looked at Taskmaster for a long moment. Then he spoke. Not about the fight, not about strategy or tactics or the war. He spoke about history. He told Taskmaster the truth. The real history of the Vampire-Lycan War. Not the version Victor had constructed. Not the narrative the Coven had maintained for centuries. The truth, that the war had not begun as a natural conflict between species. It had been engineered, designed, orchestrated by a single ancient vampire who had looked at two species and decided that the most effective way to control both was to ensure they destroyed each other. The name landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Taskmaster listened without interruption as Lucian laid out centuries of manipulation, fabricated betrayals, manufactured incidents designed to inflame hatred, the systematic elimination of anyone on either side who questioned the narrative. Both species had been lied to from the beginning. Both had been shaped into weapons pointed at each other by a hand neither had ever seen clearly enough to recognize. Taskmaster processed this information the way he processed all information, systematically, without emotional distortion. He compared it against what he had observed during his time within the Coven. The subtle inconsistencies in Victor behavior, the carefully controlled flow of information, the way dissent was handled not through argument but through silencing. The pieces aligned with a precision that confirmed what Lucian was saying. The war was not a war. It was a prison. And both species had been inmates for so long they had forgotten the walls existed. Taskmaster looked at Selene, who had emerged from the shadows during Lucian's account. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes carried the particular devastation of someone who had just been told that everything they believed was a lie. 6 centuries of service. 6 centuries of killing Lycans in the name of a cause that had been fabricated by the very leader she had sworn to protect. For the first time since arriving in this world, Taskmaster felt something he had not expected to feel. Not curiosity, not tactical calculation. Something older and more human. He looked at these two creatures, one vampire and one Lycan, standing in the ruins of a church built by humans who had been dead for 500 years, and he saw not monsters, but prisoners. Prisoners of a lie so old it had become indistinguishable from truth. And he understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent his entire life studying how things worked, that no amount of combat skill could dismantle a war built on deception. Swords could not cut through lies. Shields could not block the weight of fabricated history. The enemy was not Lucian. The enemy was not the Lycans. The enemy was the architecture of a deception so vast and so old that it had become the foundation upon which both societies were built. How do you fight a war when the real enemy is the one who convinced you the war was necessary? The question settled over the ruined church like a shadow. Neither Selene or Lucian had an answer. Taskmaster did not have one either. But he had something that neither of them possessed. He had the perspective of an outsider, a human who had arrived in this world with no history, no allegiance, no centuries of accumulated hatred clouding his judgment. He could see the board clearly because he had never been a piece on it. Before any of them could speak further, the ground trembled. Not from an attack, not from Lycan or vampire forces, from something deeper. Something ancient that had been sleeping beneath the surface of their world for longer than any of them had been alive. The tremor passed through the stone floor of the church and radiated outward, carrying with it a vibration that felt less like an earthquake and more like a heartbeat. Selene froze. She recognized the sensation. Her eyes widened with something that Taskmaster had never seen in them before. Genuine fear. The name left her lips as barely more than a whisper. But the weight it carried filled the entire church. The first vampire, the original, the progenitor of the entire species, the creature from which every vampire in existence had descended. He had been sleeping for centuries, entombed in a crypt beneath the oldest Coven stronghold, preserved in a state of suspended animation that was neither life nor death, and something had just awakened him. The tremor subsided. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. In that silence, every warrior present understood that the war they had been fighting, the deception that had sustained it, the fragile revelations that had just begun to reshape their understanding of their own history, all of it was about to be rendered irrelevant. Because Marcus was not a warrior. Marcus was not a general. Marcus was something else entirely. Marcus was the first predator. And the first predator did not fight wars. The first predator simply took what it wanted. Marcus Corvinus rose from his tomb the way a storm rises from a calm sea. Without warning, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that the world had changed during the centuries he had been asleep. He emerged from the crypt beneath the ancient Coven stronghold and stood in the morning light for the first time in over a millennium, and the world around him recoiled. He was not what the legends had described. The stories painted Marcus as a king, a figure of noble bearing and ancient authority. The creature that stood in the courtyard of the old estate was something else. He was tall and angular, his features sharpened by centuries of dormancy into something that looked less like a face and more like a mask carved from pale stone. His eyes were not the blue of vampire elders. They were black, completely, utterly black, as though they did not reflect light but consumed it. His wings, massive and bat-like, unfolded from his back with a leathery snap that sent debris scattering across the courtyard. He was the first vampire, and he carried the origin of the species in every line of his body. He did not speak, not at first. He simply stood and breathed, and with each breath, something in the air around him shifted. Birds fell silent. Dogs in distant streets began howling. The very atmosphere seemed to compress, as though the weight of his presence was a physical force that pressed against everything within his radius. Even Selene, who had stood against armies without flinching, took an involuntary step backward. Marcus looked at the world and found it unsatisfactory. This was evident not in his words but in his actions. He moved through the Coven stronghold like a predator surveying territory that belonged to him by right of ancient ownership. Vampires who had lived for centuries bowed their heads as he passed, not out of respect but out of an instinct so deep it predated thought. He was their father, their origin, the source from which every drop of vampire blood had flowed. And his return carried the implicit message that everything they had built, every structure of power and authority they had established during his absence, was subject to his claim. Victor was the first to challenge that claim. The confrontation was inevitable. Two ancient beings, each one accustomed to absolute authority, each one believing the world belonged to them by different rights. Victor by centuries of governance, Marcus by centuries of existence. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. Marcus did not defeat Victor through superior technique. He defeated him through something that could not be countered. Raw, unfiltered primordial power. The power of the original. The power of a creature that had been old when the pyramids were young. Victor fell. And with him, the political structure of the entire vampire coven collapsed in a single afternoon. Taskmaster watched, yet not intervened. Not because he was afraid, though fear was closer to the surface than he would have admitted. He had not intervened because he was doing what he always did. He was studying. He was watching Marcus move, fight, and dominate, cataloging every technique, every movement pattern, every display of supernatural ability. His photographic reflexes were recording everything, filing each observation into the vast library of combat knowledge he had been building since his arrival. And what he recorded troubled him. Marcus did not fight with technique. He fought with instinct. Every movement he made was driven not by trained skill, but by something older and more fundamental. His attacks were not patterns that could be predicted and countered. They were expressions of a predatory nature so ancient and so refined that it had bypassed the need for conscious strategy entirely. He did not think about how to fight. He simply fought, and every movement was perfect because it originated from a place deeper than thought. This was the problem. Taskmaster could copy technique. He could replicate patterns. He could reproduce any fighting style with flawless precision. But Marcus did not have a style. Marcus had instinct. And instinct could not be copied because it was not a series of movements. It was a state of being, a way of existing in combat that was woven into the genetic fabric of the first vampire at a level that preceded learned behavior. The alliance formed within 24 hours. It was not a comfortable alliance. Selene and Lucian stood on opposite sides of a planning table, their centuries of mutual hatred temporarily shelved but nowhere near forgotten. Taskmaster stood between them, not as a mediator but as a tactical coordinator. The enemy was no longer each other. The enemy was Marcus. And Marcus was something neither species could face alone. The first engagement confirmed every fear Taskmaster had about the first vampire. He fought Marcus in the ruins of the Coven training grounds, a space he had come to know intimately over the previous weeks. He entered the fight with every technique he had ever copied: vampire sword forms, Lycan hunting patterns, death dealer tactics, human martial arts spanning 1,000 years. He threw everything at Marcus in a relentless sequence of attacks designed to find any weakness, any gap, any vulnerability that could be exploited. Marcus countered all of it, not through superior technique, through evolution. Marcus adapted in real time, his body and instincts shifting to meet each new threat with a response that was not learned but generated. When Taskmaster used vampire sword forms, Marcus moved in ways that vampire sword forms had never been designed to counter. When Taskmaster switched to Lycan patterns, Marcus adjusted his positioning to neutralize the strengths those patterns relied on. He was not copying Taskmaster. He was evolving past him in real time. Taskmaster lost. For the first time since arriving in this world, he was defeated in combat. Not narrowly, not by a small margin. He was overwhelmed. Marcus' strength, speed, and predatory instinct combined into something that technique alone could not bridge. Taskmaster retreated with broken ribs and a cracked shield, limping through the corridors of the Coven stronghold, while Marcus stood in the ruined training grounds and watched him go with those black, depthless eyes. The retreat was painful. Not physically, though the physical pain was considerable. The pain was cognitive. Taskmaster mind, which had always been his greatest weapon, was confronting a limitation it had never encountered before. He could learn anything. He could copy anything. He could replicate any technique with perfect fidelity. But Marcus was not using technique. Marcus was using power. And power was not something that could be photographed by reflexes and replayed through muscle memory. Selene found him in the Coven armory, repairing his shield. She did not offer comfort. She was not built for comfort. She offered something more valuable. She told him that every warrior, no matter how skilled, eventually encountered something that could not be defeated through skill alone. The question was not whether you could win. The question was whether you could evolve when winning the old way was no longer possible. Taskmaster listened. He set down his tools. And for the first time in his life, he began to think not about what he could copy, but about what he could create. The shift was subtle at first. He stopped reviewing combat footage of Marcus. He stopped analyzing the first vampire movements looking for patterns to replicate. Instead, he began studying Marcus from a different angle entirely. Not his technique, his behavior, his instincts, the way he responded to threats, the way he prioritized targets, the way his ancient predatory mind processed combat information and made decisions. He was no longer trying to copy Marcus. He was trying to understand him. Because understanding was the foundation of strategy, and strategy was the one weapon that did not require supernatural power to wield. Lucian joined the planning sessions. His input was invaluable. He had fought vampires for centuries and understood their instincts better than any living being. Together, the three of them began building something new. Not a fighting style, a battle plan. A comprehensive strategy designed not to match Marcus in combat, but to create conditions where his advantages became irrelevant. But Marcus was not idle. The first vampire had spent centuries asleep, but his mind had not been dormant. He had been dreaming, and in those dreams he had seen the world that existed beyond his tomb. He had watched through the eyes of his descendants. He had observed the war. He had observed the deception. And he had observed the masked human who had arrived from another dimension and disrupted the order of things. Marcus understood Taskmaster in a way that Taskmaster did not yet understand himself. He knew that the human greatest strength was also his greatest limitation. Photographic reflexes allowed him to copy anything, but they also bound him to what already existed. He could replicate the past. He could combine existing techniques in new ways, but he remained tethered to the known, to the observed, to the already created. And Marcus knew something else, something that made him more dangerous than any technique or any power. He knew that Taskmaster was still human. Beneath the mask, beneath the copied skills and the accumulated combat knowledge, there was a man made of flesh and bone. A man who bled, a man who tired, a man who could not regenerate, could not transform, could not live for centuries. For all his ability, Taskmaster remained bound by the limitations of his own biology. Marcus learned this, and he smiled for the first time since his awakening. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a smile of recognition. The predator had identified the prey's most fundamental weakness, and he was patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to exploit it. Marcus moved quickly once he understood the landscape of his new world. He did not waste time consolidating power through political maneuvering the way Victor had. Politics were a tool for creatures who needed the cooperation of others. Marcus did not need cooperation. Marcus needed obedience. And when obedience was not freely given, he took it. The first coven to fall was in Berlin. Marcus arrived alone, walked through the front doors of the stronghold, and announced that the age of vampires governing themselves was over. When the coven leader objected, Marcus removed his head with a single motion of his wing and placed it on the table where the council had been sitting. The message required no translation. Within a week, 4 more covens had submitted, not out of loyalty, out of the very specific terror that comes from witnessing something that cannot be opposed. But Marcus's ambitions extended beyond the vampires. He looked at the Lycans and saw not enemies but resources. The centuries of war between the species had been, in his view, a waste of valuable stock. Both vampires and Lycans descended from the same ancient source. Both were expressions of a genetic legacy that he had originated, and in his vision of the future both would serve him. Those who resisted would be eliminated. Those who submitted would be integrated into a new order that would make the old covens look like villages. He began building an army, not of vampires, not of Lycans, forced into service through a combination of supernatural dominance and the simple, brutal mathematics of survival. Fight for Marcus or die. The choice was not complex, and most creatures, regardless of species, chose survival. And then there were the humans. Marcus did not hate humans. Hatred required emotional investment, and Marcus had evolved beyond such inefficiencies. He viewed humans the way a farmer viewed livestock. They were necessary. Their blood sustained the vampire population. Their labor could be directed toward construction and infrastructure. Their bodies could be used as soldiers in engagements where more valuable assets needed to be preserved. Humans were not enemies in Marcus's eyes. Humans were materials. The first human settlements fell within a month, not through open warfare, through systematic predatory efficiency. Marcus forces moved through rural regions and small cities, establishing dominance not through destruction but through occupation. Humans were given a choice that was structurally identical to the one offered to vampires and Lycans. Serve or perish. Most served. The ones who resisted served as examples. Taskmaster received the reports with the focused calm of a commander processing intelligence. He had spent the days following his defeat by Marcus developing not just a strategy but a philosophy of engagement. He could not defeat Marcus through combat. He had established that. He could not outmatch him through power. That was self-evident, but there was something he could do that Marcus could not. He could unite. Marcus' power was absolute but isolating. His dominance forced submission, and submission bred resentment, and resentment bred the quiet, patient kind of rebellion that grew in the dark like roots beneath stone. Every creature that served Marcus did so out of fear. And fear, while effective in the short term, was a foundation that crumbled the moment the object of fear showed weakness. Taskmaster proposed the impossible. An alliance between vampires, Lycans, and humans. Not an alliance of convenience. Not a temporary ceasefire. A genuine, coordinated military partnership in which all 3 factions would fight as a single force against Marcus and his conscript army. The proposal was met with silence. Selene stared at him as though he had lost his mind. Lucian, who had spent his entire existence fighting vampires, listened with the controlled stillness of someone who was weighing the magnitude of what was being asked against the magnitude of what was at stake. The human representatives, a small group of resistance fighters who had been operating from the margins of the supernatural war, looked at the 2 immortal leaders flanking Taskmaster with the naked distrust of people who had spent their lives being prey. The distrust was not unreasonable. Centuries of war had created wounds that could not be healed by a proposal delivered in a planning room. Vampires had slaughtered Lycan families. Lycans had torn vampires apart in the streets. Both species had treated humans as resources to be consumed. The idea that these 3 groups could stand side by side in battle required not just tactical logic but a fundamental rewiring of how each species viewed the others. Taskmaster did not try to convince them with words. He understood that trust could not be talked into existence. It had to be built, and the foundation of trust was not shared belief. It was shared experience. He began training them together. The first session was a disaster. Vampire warriors refused to spar with Lycans. Lycan fighters snarled at humans who attempted to join their training rotations. Human soldiers, outmatched physically by both species, struggled to keep pace with exercises designed for supernatural physiology. The training ground became a microcosm of the war itself, with each faction retreating into its own corner and viewing the others with suspicion. Taskmaster addressed this the way he addressed every problem, through demonstration. He paired himself with a human soldier and fought against a vampire and a Lycan simultaneously. He used human tactics, vampire techniques, and Lycan patterns interchangeably, showing not just that the styles could coexist, but that they complemented each other in ways that none of them had ever considered. A Lycan frontal assault created openings that a vampire blade could exploit. A vampire speed strike created confusion that a human ranged attack could capitalize on. Human tactical coordination provided the structural framework that allowed vampire and Lycan abilities to be deployed with maximum efficiency. He was not just training soldiers. He was building a language, a shared system of combat communication that transcended species boundaries and allowed warriors who had spent centuries trying to kill each other to function as a single organism. The shift happened gradually, not in days, in the slow incremental accretion of small moments. A Lycan fighter catching a vampire who stumbled during a training exercise. A vampire warrior sharing a tactical observation with a human soldier without condescension. A human medic treating a wounded Lycan without hesitation. Each moment was small. Each moment was individually insignificant. But together they formed a pattern. And patterns once established had a way of becoming expectations. And expectations once normalized had a way of becoming trust. Taskmaster trained them for 3 weeks. He trained vampires and Lycan countermeasures so they understood their allies as well as their enemies. He trained Lycans in vampire sword techniques so they could coordinate with blade fighters who moved at different speeds. He trained humans in the tactical exploitation of supernatural abilities, teaching them to position vampire and Lycan assets the way a chess player positioned pieces on a board. And he trained all of them in his own evolving combat philosophy, not his techniques. His principles: observation over assumption, adaptation over rigidity, understanding over strength. He could not give them his photographic reflexes, but he could give them the mindset that made those reflexes valuable, the willingness to watch, to learn, to change approach when the situation demanded it. By the end of the 3rd week, the army was unlike anything the Underworld had ever seen. Vampires and Lycans fighting in coordinated formations. Humans directing operations with a tactical sophistication that leveraged every supernatural asset available to them. Warriors from 3 species who had learned to read each other's movements, anticipate each other's needs, and cover each other's weaknesses. They did not trust each other. Not fully. Not yet. Centuries of hatred could not be erased in 3 weeks, and Taskmaster did not pretend otherwise. But they trusted something. They trusted the system. They trusted the framework that Taskmaster had built around them, the combat language that allowed them to function together even when their instincts screamed for separation. And more than that, they trusted Taskmaster, not because he was the strongest. He was demonstrably not. Not because he was the most powerful. He was the least powerful person in the army by any physical measure. They trusted him because he had earned it in the only way trust could truly be earned. He had shown them that he understood them. All of them. He had studied each species with the same meticulous attention, learned their strengths and weaknesses without judgment, and built a system that treated all 3 as essential components of a greater whole. He was not a vampire. He was not a Lycan. He was not a supernatural being of any kind. He was a human who had walked into a war between immortals and responded not with fear or awe, but with the quiet, methodical competence of someone who understood that the greatest weapon on any battlefield was not power. It was coordination. The army marched within days. Marcus had been consolidating his forces, pushing deeper into Europe, absorbing or destroying everything in his path. Intelligence reports placed his main force moving toward an ancient site that predated every structure in the region: the Blood Temple. A place that existed in the oldest records of both vampire and Lycan history. A place where the original Corvinus strain had been born, where the first vampire and the first Lycan had been created from a single source. Marcus was going home. He was returning to the origin point of his species, to the place where his power had begun, and he was bringing an army to claim it. What he intended to do at the Blood Temple, no one could say with certainty. But every piece of intelligence suggested that his ambitions were not limited to conquest. Marcus was not building an empire. Marcus was trying to reshape the fundamental architecture of the supernatural world. He was trying to return to the beginning and start again, this time without the mutations and divisions that had split his legacy into competing species. Taskmaster studied the maps of the Blood Temple. He studied the terrain. He studied the reported composition of Marcus' forces. He studied everything that could be studied, and then he began building a battle plan that would require every lesson he had learned since arriving in this world. The plan was not built on matching Marcus' power. It was built on the one thing Marcus had never encountered and could not prepare for. 3 species fighting as one, not because they were forced to, because they had chosen to. And that distinction, Taskmaster believed, would make all the difference. Marcus marched toward the ancient Blood Temple. Behind him, an army of conscripts held together by fear. Ahead of him, an alliance held together by something far more durable. The quiet, stubborn, hard-earned trust of warriors who had learned to see each other not as enemies, but as pieces of the same solution. The Blood Temple was older than language, older than the species that traced their origins to it. It sat in a valley carved from living rock, its walls grown from the stone rather than built upon it, as though the temple had not been constructed but had emerged from the earth fully formed. The architecture was impossible. Angles that should not have connected. Spaces that seemed larger inside than their external dimensions allowed. Stone that carried a faint, persistent warmth, as though the temple itself was alive and remembering the moment of its creation. Marcus arrived first. His army spread across the valley floor like a dark tide, vampires and Lycans, and humans standing in rigid formations that spoke of obedience rather than morale. They did not cheer when Marcus descended into the temple. They did not speak at all. They stood in the silence of creatures who had been conquered and were waiting for the next thing they would be ordered to do. The alliance arrived 2 hours later. They came from 3 directions, converging on the valley in a coordinated approach that Taskmaster had designed to maximize coverage and minimize vulnerability. Human forces held the high ground, positioned along the valley ridges with weapons that had been modified for supernatural engagement. Vampire warriors occupied the intermediate terrain, ready to intercept any force that broke through the first line. Lycan fighters held the ground floor, their raw physical power deployed where it would have the greatest impact in close quarters. Taskmaster stood at the center, not behind the line, at the center, because this battle required him to be where he could see everything, and the only position that allowed that was the one where the fighting would be thickest. The battle began at dusk. Marcus did not wait for the alliance to initiate. He sent his conscript army forward in a wave designed to overwhelm through numbers. The first wave was composed primarily of lesser vampires and young Lycans, fighters with minimal experience who had been pressed into service and pointed at the enemy with minimal instruction. They were expendable. Marcus was testing the alliance defenses, probing for weaknesses, identifying where the strongest resistance originated so he could deploy his more valuable assets against those points specifically. The alliance held. Human forces on the ridges directed fire with a precision that surprised even the vampires. Modified ammunition designed to exploit vampire and Lycan vulnerabilities thinned the first wave before it reached the intermediate line. Vampire warriors engaged the survivors with coordinated blade work that had been refined during 3 weeks of joint training. And the Lycan front line met whatever broke through the second line with the raw, physical ferocity that no amount of conscription could replicate. Marcus watched from the temple entrance. His black eyes tracked the battle with the patient focus of a predator observing prey behavior. He noted the coordination. He noted the way the 3 species moved in complementary patterns rather than competing for engagement. He noted the tactical sophistication of the human forces and the way their positioning amplified the effectiveness of their supernatural allies. And he noted Taskmaster. The masked human moved through the battlefield like a current through water, engaging where needed, redirecting forces where pressure built, plugging gaps before they became breaches. He fought with a fluidity that incorporated every technique he had absorbed, switching between vampire swordwork and Lycan close-quarters combat and human tactical movement, with a seamlessness that made it impossible to identify which style he was using at any given moment. Marcus descended from the temple. He did not announce his arrival. He did not need to. The air changed. The temperature dropped. Every fighter on the battlefield, regardless of allegiance, felt the shift and understood instinctively that the first predator had entered the field. Marcus moved through the battle like a blade through silk. Vampires from the Alliance front line were thrown aside with casual, contemptuous efficiency. Lycan warriors who engaged him were dismantled in seconds, their strength meaningless against a creature who possessed strength that dwarfed their own. Human positions were obliterated by wing strikes that sent soldiers and equipment scattering across the valley floor. Taskmaster intercepted him at the temple entrance. The final duel began in the doorway of the Blood Temple, framed by stone that had witnessed the birth of two species. Marcus attacked first, and his assault was everything Taskmaster had feared and everything he had prepared for. The first vampire moved with an instinctual perfection that transcended technique. Every strike was designed to kill. Every evasion was executed at a speed that human eyes could barely track. Every transformation, every shift in body position, every deployment of wing and claw and fang was driven by a predatory intelligence that had been refining itself since before recorded history. Taskmaster countered. Every technique Marcus revealed, Taskmaster replicated. Every movement pattern that emerged from the first vampire assault, Taskmaster absorbed and reflected back. When Marcus struck with a wing slash, Taskmaster deflected with an angle copied from the motion itself. When Marcus lunged with fangs extended, Taskmaster evaded using the exact evasion pattern that Marcus's own body had just demonstrated. It was a mirror fight. Marcus attacking with instinct, Taskmaster reflecting with perfect imitation. And for a time it worked. Marcus could not land a decisive blow because every attack he launched was immediately countered by a perfect replication of its own defensive response. He was fighting himself, reflected through the body of a human who could copy anything he showed. But Marcus was not frustrated. Marcus was evolving. The first vampire began changing his approach mid-combat. Not his technique, his nature. His body shifted, his instincts adapted, and his attacks became something that had never existed before. Not learned, not practiced. Generated in real time from the deepest layer of his predatory consciousness. He was creating new movements, new combinations, new ways of fighting that had no precedent because they were being born in the moment of their execution. Taskmaster copying ability hit its wall. He could replicate what he observed, but Marcus was generating attacks faster than observation could process them. The techniques were not being drawn from an existing library. They were being invented in real time, and by the time Taskmaster's eyes recorded a movement and his body prepared to replicate it, Marcus had already moved on to something else entirely. The first real blow landed. Marcus' wing caught Taskmaster across the chest and sent him skidding across the temple floor. His ribs cracked. His shield, already damaged from their first encounter, split along a stress fracture that had been weakening the metal for weeks. He rolled to his feet, but the cost was visible. Blood seeped through his tactical suit. His breathing carried the particular wet sound of damaged lungs. Selene and Lucian engaged Marcus from the flanks, buying Taskmaster seconds to recover. Their coordination was instinctive now, the product of 3 weeks of training that had taught them to read each other without words. Selene attacked from the left with blade techniques refined over 6 centuries. Lucian attacked from the right in full transformation, his claws tracing arcs that would have bisected any lesser opponent. Marcus handled both of them, but the effort required attention, and attention divided was attention exploited. Taskmaster stood in the center of the temple, bleeding, breathing hard, holding a cracked shield and a sword that had been notched in 3 places. And in that moment he understood something that would define the rest of his life. Copying was not enough, had never been enough. His entire existence, his entire identity had been built on the ability to replicate what others created. He was a mirror. The most perfect mirror ever made, capable of reflecting any technique with flawless fidelity. But a mirror, no matter how perfect, was still bounded by what stood in front of it. It could only reflect what existed. It could only show what was already there. Marcus was creating, and creation could not be copied because it did not yet exist to be observed. Taskmaster closed his eyes, not in surrender. He stopped watching Marcus. He stopped trying to record and replicate. He reached into the vast library of combat knowledge he had accumulated, and he began to build something new. Not a combination of existing techniques, not a fusion of copied styles. Something original. Something that had never been performed by any warrior in any tradition, because it existed only in the space between traditions, in the gaps that no single style had ever been designed to fill. He moved forward. Marcus sensed him coming and turned to meet the attack. The first vampire launched a strike designed to end the fight, a movement generated from pure instinct, perfect and unprecedented and lethal. Taskmaster did not copy it. He did not counter it with a reflection. He moved in a way that was entirely his own. A response that was not a replication of anything, but was instead an original creation born from the synthesis of everything he had ever learned. The movement was not perfect in the way that copied techniques were perfect. It was imperfect in the way that all original creation is imperfect, carrying the unmistakable texture of something that had never been done before. And it worked. Marcus struck where Taskmaster had been. Taskmaster was not there. Not because he had copied an evasion, because he had created a position that no evasion pattern had ever occupied. Marcus shifted to pursue. Taskmaster was already in a place that no pursuit pattern had ever been designed to reach. The first vampire instincts, refined over millennia, were generating responses to threats that followed known patterns. And Taskmaster was no longer following any known pattern. He was inventing, move by move, breath by breath, creating a fighting style in real time that had no precedent, no tradition, no origin except the mind of the man executing it. Marcus could not counter what he could not predict, and he could not predict what had never existed before. The final strike came from an angle that no copied technique could have produced. Taskmaster's sword found the gap in Marcus' defenses that no copied technique could have identified. The blade entered the first vampire chest at a point where his ancient physiology carried a vulnerability that had existed since his original transformation but had never been exploited because no warrior had ever fought in a way that could reach it. Marcus fell. The first vampire, the original predator, the progenitor of an entire species, collapsed on the stone floor of the temple where his kind had been born. His black eyes dimmed, his wings folded. The ancient predatory intelligence that had driven him for millennia went quiet, not with a roar, not with a final defiant statement, with a whisper that sounded almost like recognition, as though in the final moment Marcus understood what had defeated him. Not power, not technique, not imitation, creation. Taskmaster stood over him, bleeding, human in every way that mattered. And for the first time in his life, he was not holding a sword that copied someone else's style. He was holding a sword that had just written a new one. The temple fell silent. The battle outside continued for a time, but without Marcus driving them, the conscript army fragmented. Vampires and Lycans who had been forced to fight for a creature they feared simply stopped fighting. Not all at once. In ones and twos, then in groups, then in waves. The silence of surrender spread outward from the temple like ripples from a stone in still water. And then in the deepest chamber of the blood temple a sound began. Almost imperceptible. A hum that vibrated through the ancient stone and settled into the bones of everyone present. The air in the temple shimmered. A faint line of light appeared in the space between two pillars. A line that grew wider, brighter, more defined. The dimensional gateway was reopening. The light from the gateway cast long shadows across the temple floor, and in those shadows the war ended. Not with a treaty, not with a ceremony, with exhaustion. The conscript army that Marcus had assembled simply dissolved, its components dispersing back toward whatever lives they had been taken from. Vampires returned to covens that no longer had leaders. Lycans returned to packs that had been scattered across a continent. Humans returned to cities that did not know what had nearly happened to them. And the Alliance forces, the unprecedented collection of warriors from 3 species who had learned to fight as one, stood in the valley outside the Blood Temple and watched the sun rise over a world that was, for the first time in centuries, not at war. The silence that followed Marcus' death was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something ending without anything yet ready to take its place. The old structures were gone. Victor was dead. Marcus was dead. The political architecture that had sustained both vampire and Lycan societies for centuries had been dismantled in a matter of weeks. What remained was rubble, and rubble, while honest, is not a foundation. Rebuilding began slowly. Selene took command of what remained of the vampire covens, not by proclamation. She was the most senior death dealer still alive, the only warrior with the credibility and the combat reputation to hold the fragments together. She did not want the role. That was precisely why she was the right choice. Leadership thrust upon the reluctant is almost always more durable than leadership seized by the eager. Lucian returned to the Lycans. For the first time in his long life, he returned not as a rebel leader but as a statesman. The Lycans had spent centuries defining themselves through opposition to the vampires. Without that opposition, they were forced to confront a question they had never asked. Who were they when they were not fighting? The answer, as it turned out, was complicated. But Lucian was patient. He had spent centuries fighting. He could spend decades building. The fragile peace between the species held, not because trust had been established. It had not fully. It held because every creature on both sides had seen what happened when a greater threat emerged. They had watched their ancient enmity become irrelevant in the face of something that could have destroyed them all. And that memory, still fresh and raw, was a more effective deterrent than any treaty. Taskmaster stayed longer than he expected. The dimensional gateway had reopened, but it was not stable. It pulsed and flickered, its edges undefined, its duration uncertain. He had time. Not unlimited time, but enough to see the first stages of the rebuilding. Enough to watch former enemies occupy the same space without reaching for weapons. Enough to witness the small, unremarkable moments that constituted the real foundation of peace. A vampire sharing information with a Lycan scout. A human medic treating injuries without asking which species the patient belonged to. A group of young warriors from all three factions training together in the courtyard of the old Coven stronghold, practicing the coordinated combat techniques that Taskmaster had taught them. Selene found him on the last night. He was standing on the ramparts of the stronghold, looking out over a city that was beginning to rebuild itself. The gateway hummed behind him, its light painting the stone walls in shifting patterns of white and gold. She approached and stood beside him without speaking. They had developed a relationship over the preceding weeks that defied easy categorization. Not friendship exactly. Not respect in the conventional sense. Something more specific. The mutual recognition of two people who understood war at a level that most beings would never reach. She offered him a place among the death dealers. The offer was genuine. She had the authority to extend it, and she believed, with the pragmatic certainty that defined her worldview, that Taskmaster abilities would be invaluable during the Reconstruction period. He could train the next generation of warriors. He could serve as a bridge between species. He could become something that the Underworld had never had before. A human whose value was not measured in blood, but in knowledge. He declined, gently, without elaboration. The refusal was not about the offer itself. It was about something deeper. Something that Taskmaster had been processing since the moment he defeated Marcus in the Blood Temple. Lucian found him an hour later. The Lycan leader had recovered from their duel with the particular resilience of a creature whose body was designed to heal from wounds that would have killed anything else. He offered Taskmaster something different, not a place in an existing order, the leadership of a new one. Lucian proposed the creation of a united warrior order, a force drawn from all three species that would serve as guardians of the fragile peace. He wanted Taskmaster to lead it, not because Taskmaster was the strongest, because Taskmaster was the only being in this world who all three species had learned to trust. Taskmaster declined this as well, for the same reason. Not disrespect, not indifference. Something that he could not fully articulate but felt with absolute certainty. His journey had never been about finding a new home. When the dimensional rift had pulled him from the Hydra facility and deposited him beneath the streets of Budapest, he had arrived as a weapon. A mercenary. A man whose identity was defined by what he could copy and who he could kill. He had been the most dangerous weapon in any room, but he had been a weapon nonetheless. Tools to be pointed, skills to be sold, a life measured in contracts completed and targets eliminated. This world had changed that. Not because it was kind. It was not. Not because it welcomed him. It did not. It had changed him because it demanded something that copying could not provide. It had demanded creation. In the Blood Temple facing Marcus, Taskmaster had been forced to move beyond replication and into invention. He had been forced to become not a mirror, but a source. Not a copy, but an original. And in that transformation, he had discovered something about himself that no amount of copied technique could have taught him. He was not a weapon. He never had been. He was a student. The greatest student war had ever produced. And the thing about being a student is that eventually, if you study long enough and deeply enough, you graduate. You stop learning from others and start learning from yourself. You stop reflecting what exists and start creating what does not. The gateway was stabilizing. Its light had shifted from flickering to steady, its edges sharpening from suggestion to definition. It would not remain open indefinitely. Taskmaster adjusted his shield, which had been repaired but still carried the scars of 2 battles with the first vampire. He checked his sword, which had been reforged but still bore the notch from the strike that had ended Marcus. He collected himself the way he always collected himself before a transition, calmly, methodically, with the focused awareness of someone who understood that every ending was also a beginning. Before he stepped through, he turned to face the warriors who had gathered. Selene. Human fighters, vampire elders, Lycan lieutenants. They stood in a loose semicircle around the gateway, watching the masked human who had arrived from another world and changed theirs in ways that would take generations to fully understand. Taskmaster looked at them. His mask concealed whatever expression his face carried. But his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that filled the chamber and settled into the memory of every creature present. The greatest warrior is not the one who can copy every move. It is the one who knows when to create a new one. The words were simple, unadorned. The kind of statement that sounded obvious until you considered what it meant. A lifetime of imitation reaching its conclusion in a single act of creation. A career built on reflection ending with the decision to become a source of light rather than a surface that merely bounced it back. He stepped through the gateway. The light swallowed him the way it had swallowed him in the Hydra facility, and then the gateway closed. The light faded. The hum subsided. The stone walls of the Blood Temple returned to their ancient silence. He was gone. And long after the last battle faded into history, the Underworld remembered that its greatest champion was the only warrior who proved perfection is not copied. It is earned.